I want you to imagine a stewardship emphasis or an offering like we're going to take up next week, where no one is pleading, no one's begging, the preacher's not up there saying, please give and help us meet this need, but instead people are lining up demanding that the church take their money. Boy, if that ever happened, y'all better step back. Jesus is about to return. Amen? But what if it was that way? It's happened before. The Macedonians, they are that group of people. They are that church that actually stood up and said, no, we want to give more than most people would expect us to give. I'm thinking, as I thought about this, they didn't have much. In our world today, and in fact in our culture, that group of people would have been the people with their hands out. Right? Give me, give me. Instead, they're saying, please let us give. And I'm going to tell you, man, this has put great conviction upon my heart. Why don't I think like that? Why don't I think like the Macedonians like that more often? See, these Macedonians had a vision for ministry. It's reflected in their giving here. They desired that these fellow saints who were in dire straits to be ministered to, and so they gave to make sure that that would happen. Now listen, one of the big questions I get about giving, because you may be thinking, okay, they gave beyond their means. All right, preacher, how much am I supposed to give? And that's a fair question. Now, many answers and much discussion over this question surrounds the tithe. And if you know much about the tithe is an approach of giving that's talked about in the Bible. Now, to most Christians, they assume that the tithe means 10% of your income. And that's in part because, Abraham, if we look back to the Old Testament, we say Abraham gave 10% of his earnings from his battles to Melchizedek, the priest. You also see the testimony of Jacob promising to give 10% of what he had to God. You get into the Old Testament law, and the Old Testament law had some restrictions that were given to the Jews in the Old Testament. Which, by the way, if you really get into the weeds of it, it wasn't 10%. 10%, actually, if you added all the tithes that they would give over a period of time, all told, the Old Testament saints would have given somewhere around 23% of their what they had as a tithe. So what does that mean for us? We're New Testament Christians. We're not Jews living under the old Mosaic law. What does that mean for us? Again, we're not bound by it. So are we to give 10%? Are we to give 20%? But here's some things to consider. It's true that the principle of the tithe predates the law. We look at the story of Abraham and giving a tithe to Melchizedek. And even Jesus himself, Jesus commended the tithe, but that was before he established a new covenant, when he died. And when you read through the New Testament epistles, like we're reading today in 2 Corinthians, never negate the tithe, but on the flip side, they never command it. So what are we to give? Well, I think the real point is not that God has figured out a percentage for us in the New Testament to give, but that he expects us to be generous, and that generous people are the kind of people, and this is the fourth point, that give without limits. Because that's how the Macedonians operated. Look at verse 5. He says, "And this, not as we expected, that they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us." Let me just ask you a question. Do you think that if the Macedonians had limited their giving to 10%, we would have been talking about them today? See, the likelihood is they gave well above 10%. I mean, 10% of not much is not much, right? Now, we're talking about them because they had an attitude, and that was, we're just going to give without limits. They gave as the Lord directed them. The Lord set the limits for them. In fact, notice that they gave themselves. Their generosity wasn't just something they did, it was who they were. But that doesn't mean they were just being random in their giving. They weren't going down to the town square and tossing out bills and passing out money to whomever until they ran out of money. No, they were guided by the Lord as they gave. Notice, it says that they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. What we see here is a group of people who are walking with Jesus day by day, engaging in an ongoing relationship with the Lord. And such was the relationship with the Lord that as they gave, as the Spirit prompted them, they gave by the will of God. Nothing more, nothing less. That's why we've challenged you this past week, and if you've not done this yet, I would encourage you to do so, to take time between now and next Sunday and to pray about this offering that is to come. Just pray. We're challenging you to fast and pray. For some of you, this may be a new concept. But maybe you do like I did this past week, and I just took a day where at sundown, before sundown, I ate a meal, and I did not eat another time until the next day at that same time as the sun went down. And during the times that I would be hungry, that I would take time to eat, I use that as a time to pray and say, Lord, guide me. Show me your will as I give next week. By the way, I think it's important to know that as the Macedonians were guided by the Lord to give without limits, that throughout this story, what you see of them, they're not giving begrudgingly, but they're giving joyfully. Joyfully. You know, you've heard that old expression, give until it hurts? There may be a better expression. There may be a better expression, and that is give until it doesn't hurt. You know, somehow we sort of turn giving into a painful experience. Why is that? Like it's a hard thing to do. You know, it's really easy to be walking by the Salvation Army bucket, right, at Christmas time and drop a few coins in, but reach in there and grab a $100 bill. Well, that hurts. It means you might not be able to buy that brand new phone that you've been wanting, right? That's giving until it hurts. But when you give until it doesn't hurt, you move past that kind of thinking. You're giving because it's joyful. When you get to that point, you find freedom and joy in giving. That's what giving without limits looks like.